everybody, and welcome back to my extended appreciation of the Camel discography, which also happens to take the form of a ranking video. We're in the top 4 now, which in some ways is maybe less interesting as an exercise because these albums are, of course, pretty universally all accepted as great, so there's maybe less interest in making an argument for their greatness. But then at the same time, the stakes feel a little bit higher here too, right? Because these are all accepted as great albums. I've seen people get a little bit more invested in the question of where they all stack up relative to each other, right? So it'll be kind of an interesting exercise to sort those out and try to make an argument for why I've put them where I have. And I've put a little surprise at the end, which is not part of the official ranking, but, is a Camel-related album that I think is noteworthy. So be sure to stick around for that. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project influenced but not limited by progressive rock. I'm a big Camel fan, of course, and I think a lot of their particular value of, melodic, complex, but emotionally engaging music has really informed a lot of what I do. Check us out on your favorite streaming service or Bandcamp. I've put the self-titled album at 4th, and, for a long time, my experience of this album was really dominated by the song Never Let Go, right? Which is a surpassingly great song in a way that I think is accessible and obvious even to somebody who's not a prog rock specialist, even to somebody without a narrow interest in that genre, right? It's great in a classic rock kind of way, right? Where even people who generally don't like solos and long instrumental bits will probably like these solos and long instrumental bits, and I think probably could have been a classic rock radio staple if it had happened to have been heard by the right people at the right time, but it just wasn't. But you could slip it into the playlist of any classic rock station in America, and I think everybody would take for granted that it deserved to be there, and, your mom could sing along with it by the end of the second chorus. And I think it's easy sometimes for the experience of the album as a whole to get a little bit dominated by that particular track. But what defines the rest of the album for me is jazziness, and by that I mean a particular kind of subtlety and deftness of touch combined with looseness of performance. From an instrumental standpoint, everybody in the band is already at the height of their powers here, and the ease of their interplay and the way that they can find subtle variations in a theme is just perfect. And in fact, I think most of the core instrumental ideas, the composition, is maybe a little bit more straightforward, a little bit less developed here than it would be on the next several albums. But the performance and the development of those ideas really is as good as they ever got, and there's more room, I think, in the arrangements for, extended solos, or a little bit more space for players to kind of go their own way. You could argue that their individual styles haven't quite cohered into a unified vision here as they would later, but the results are so pleasurable that objection is kind of beside the point. So I've put Snow Goose at number 3, and that's not at all a criticism of this album, even though, I think a lot of people probably would put it at number 1. There's just certain things that I find really, really impressive about numbers 1 and 2, so, But that being said, this album, of course, has no lyrics, and so what defines it is more a progression of instrumental textures. And what makes the album work, of course, is the way that progression of instrumental textures and compositional ideas plays off each other. Obviously, that's not at all an interesting statement, right? You could argue that pretty much all of progressive rock is, as much as anything, kind of defined by the way that instrumental textures and compositional ideas play off each other. But in this case, I think the absence of lyrics means that the band can progress more quickly between textures and they have more space to fill with interesting ideas. And they've actually managed to fill that space with consistently compelling material, right? There's a huge amount of musical information that is occurring here within a condensed space. And they're giving everything just enough space to make itself felt and understood without anything being dragged out or extended beyond the minimum amount of time that's needed for it to make an impact. So that compression of composition is one thing that makes this really impressive. Another thing I think is the restraint of it, right? And a lot of prog rock fans really hate the word bombastic or, bristle when it's used, which is totally understandable because that word has a lot of bad associations around, being thrown at things like Carnival 9, right? But, there are certain things, just in the world, there are certain musical textures that are loud and flashy and sonically intense, and there are certain musical textures that are subtle and understated. And there's something that, Carnival 9 is doing in its loudness and flashiness that this album never, ever does. Now, again, that's true of a lot of Camel, right? That sense of subtlety and restraint is, I think, part of what makes them appealing. Sometimes part of what might make them less accessible than some other classic prog. But what distinguishes this album ultimately is the combination of that characteristic restraint and subtlety with the way in which they really have managed to pack a huge amount of smart, compelling musical information into a relatively small space, into a single album, right? They've essentially taken what could have been a double album's worth of good songwriting ideas and put them into a short single album, and that's fantastic. Just as an aside, I've listened to the original and the 2013 recording back to back a couple times. I don't know that there's enough difference there to really merit a separate entry for the 2013 re-recording, so, I haven't done that. So I've put Mirage at number 2, and a little story to maybe help explain why. I have a friend at work who is very into music and has never been particularly interested in or familiar with prog rock, and he happened to hear Fragile a few times and really, really enjoyed it. Obviously, that's a very accessible album for people who aren't necessarily into that kind of music. And so he asked me to give him some recommendations for some other prog rock albums he might enjoy, right? So I burned some CDs for him to listen to in his car. I gave him a copy of Red. I gave him Land of Grey and Pink. I gave him a carefully curated single disc version of Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, a couple other things of that caliber. And he really didn't like any of it except for Mirage. And my point isn't that this album is great because, people like it who don't like Red or Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. My point is just that there's something about this album that overcame his innate resistance to that type of material. And I'd actually say it's a fusion of a couple of things, right? It's, on the one hand, a sense of kind of energetic humanity, right? These guys feel like normal guys in a way that John Anderson or Peter Gabriel or Robert Fripp don't. And on this album, it feels like they want to rock out in a way that Yes or King Crimson maybe don't, even if sometimes those bands are louder or faster or heavier. You listen to something like Free Fall or the fast part in White Rider or that bit at the beginning of Lady Fantasy where the guitar and the electric piano do that really fast swirly thing in unison, and you can kind of feel the sweat that they're putting into it, right? And the way it might almost be on the verge of falling apart. This album feels effortful in a way where Yes or King Crimson kind of feels like they're doing it without breaking a sweat. But that sense of everyman approachability is matched here with writing and playing that really is masterful and intricate and dynamic. And that's what feels special about this album. It has the quality of a young, energetic band desperately trying to prove something, But usually when bands are young and energetic and trying to prove something, they're not also turning in writing and performance of this high a caliber. So I've put Moonmadness at number 1, which almost feels like too safe a choice, right? I feel like I should have something here a little more unexpected that I could have some fun arguing for. And I will say that this album doesn't quite go to any of the extremes that the other classic ones do, right? It doesn't rock as hard as Mirage. It's not as richly composed as Snow Goose. It doesn't have any one standout track that's just absolutely killer the way that Never Let Go is. It's not as atmospheric as Rain Dances. But it has enough of each of those qualities to satisfy, and it balances those. And what really carries it to the top, the real brilliance of it, is the way that all those qualities are balanced with each other. And what gets me about this album is just how perfectly calibrated it is as an album, right? Every type of song you would expect on an album like this is present, and it's shaped just as it should be, and it's sequenced just as it should be. You have a couple of short melodic mood pieces and a couple of jazzy workouts, a couple harder-edged songs, and a couple of softer songs, right? Longer songs, shorter songs. And they're all just the right length for that type of song, and you've got your 10-minute epic with your crashing conclusion right at the end. I don't know if I can think of another album from this era that is so neatly balanced and calibrated as an album. It's an archetype in that regard. If you were trying to perfectly sequence and balance an art rock album, this is probably, I would say, as good a model as you could find. And that's really where the brilliance of it lies. And just as a bonus track, I want to talk a little bit about Colin Bass's solo album, An Outcast of the Islands. This isn't part of the ranking, and I'm certainly not trying to imply here that it's better than Moonmadness, but I thought I'd throw it in because it really is a lovely album that I was not aware of until a couple of years ago. And Colin Bass, if you're not familiar, though you probably are if you're watching this video, was the very appropriately named bass player who joined in 1979 and has probably been the most consistent band member since then, other than, of course, Latimer. And this is Bass's first solo album, and Latimer's not involved in the writing, but he plays guitar on nearly every song. His style as a lead player is quite recognizable. I think it'll be evident to anybody who is familiar with his work in Camel. Most of the drums are played by Dave Stewart, who's also been very regular for, most of my lifetime. And Bass's voice and singing style are actually quite similar to Latimer's. So I've heard this album kind of referred to in some quarters as a secret lost Camel album. And I don't know if I'd go that far necessarily, but that is kind of a fun way to think about it. And if you're someone who would be excited to discover a secret lost Camel album, I do think you'll enjoy this one. Just thought I'd toss in a mention of it because it's an interesting detour, well worth your attention if you're a Camel fan. Also a really fascinating album cover. I think it's photos of driftwood that happen to look like strange animals. But I'm not totally sure about that. I've never even been completely sure if it's a photo or a painting. All right, thanks everybody for sticking around for my thoughts on the Camel discography. Feel free to put any additional comments or disagreements down below. Despite all my intellectual poses, I am just as vulnerable to the need for external affirmation as anybody else. So, like, comment, subscribe, check out Electric Brain, Electric Shadow on your preferred streaming platform or on Bandcamp, and I hope everybody has a good week.